The slides look okay. Can you see,
Yep.
the viewer mode, not the presenter mode, right?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, good. And let me see if I can turn on the mouse again here as a laser pointer. Hopefully that works. Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here, at least virtually. It's sort of funny in a way. I'm going to talk about virtual reality, and we're all realizing that our lives are increasingly becoming virtual. I'm going to do a different sort of talk here. This is a bit of an outlier from what I've done in the past. So I know you guys, many of you very well, and we've had so much overlap through things like our CREATE grant and the Lake Ontario Virtual Reality Consortium that we're working on, and all these things, and CapNet. And so I know a lot of you have seen much of my standard talk before, and I always hate being one of those people that gives the same talk, the exact same talk over and over again. So I'm going to start with a little bit of the old stuff, but most of what I'm going to present to you today is quite new, and so it's less polished than hopefully it will be in the future. But the reason I wanted to do it with the gang here is just because we do have such a strong history of collaboration, and I think there's a lot of possibilities to grow that. And so I wanted to tell you a bit more, not just about what we have done in my lab, but what we are doing and some of the things I'm thinking about going forward, and the directions that I want to take the lab in and of its own right, but also through expanding collaborations. And so I've had a lot of opportunities recently just to think about the big picture that the lab is going in. And the idea that I've converged on is this proposal for what I'm calling immersive neuroscience as a general approach for bringing cognitive neuroscience closer to the real world. And so that's really what I want to talk to you about today, is some of the things we're starting to think about and need to refine, and that would benefit from additional collaborations and some constructive criticism from great colleagues. So I'll just start. Some of the first part of the talk is going to be a bit familiar to many of you who've seen my talks before, but it gives you a sense of where this research direction is coming from. So as Laurie said, when I first started at Western working with Mel Goodale, who of course is a powerhouse in the study of actions, Mel and I decided together that we wanted to use what at that time was a brand new technique, functional MRI, to study actions. And at that point, a lot of the things that had been done in the study of actions were the study of what I would call proxies for real actions, things like watching movies of people doing actions, imagining doing an action, pretending you were doing an action, like show me how you would use a hammer, those kind of things. And a lot of that was because of these constraints of functional MRI, that you have people, they have to lay supine, they're in this 60-centimeter bore, it's easy to show images, but it's harder to put real equipment and so on in. So those were kind of the norms in the field. And of course, way back then, in some of our earlier studies, we developed these approaches, which I know others at York, like Simona Monaco and Denise and Doug, have also gone in this direction. We developed approaches where we could have people doing real actions in the scanner, originally with what we called the grasparatus, and later just with platforms. So we could have people doing things like reaching and grasping and using tools and so on. And through some of that initial work, we discovered and characterized some areas of the human brain that play a key role in functions like grasping and reaching. But over the years, we did a number of studies that indicated that the realness of the actions and the realness of the objects upon which people were acting were important for the sorts of brain activation that you would get. So we found, for example, in grasping, you get real activation if you're actually grasping something than if you're pantomiming it, if you're doing it beside it. We found something similar with tool use. Erez, of course, was a postdoc working with me and Marlene Berman, and with my lab, he did a cool study where he found that activation patterns were different if you were performing actions on real objects versus photographs. And so all of these together suggest that for actions, realness matters. And the main reason that I think that realness matters in this situation for action, and I'm even going to push it a step further and say that I think this is a general principle for cognition, is that action in the real world is closed loop. So you have, you make a decision that you want to do some action, say grasping a coffee cup. Your motor cortex and cerebellum and so on evaluate the possible ways that you could do that, and they make a forward model and predict what seems to be the best one. You execute that action that has haptic and visual and other consequences that get fed back to your sensory system, and then you can close the loop. And you can use this closed loop in order to do a couple of things. One, you can correct mistakes if you see that something's going the wrong way, like this poor waiter here. And you can also improve your models of what the best actions to do are. So this is a really foundational idea in motor neuroscience. And I actually, the more time I spend in neuroscience, the more I think it's important as a principle for the brain in general, whether you're talking about cognitive functions or social neuroscience and things like that. Most of our interactions with the world are closed loop, and yet the way that we typically study them is often in a very reduced sense that focuses on one part of the system or another. And so this was one of the first things that really got me thinking about immersive neuroscience and the need to move neuroscience more to closed loop situations. We also did some stuff. I'm not going to go into too much detail because a lot of you have heard it from me and from my former postdoc, Jackie Snow, who's now doing some really cool stuff in her lab in Reno, Nevada. But what we found across a whole ton of different studies is that there's something that we've come to term the real object advantage, which means that the brain behaves different, the brain processes real objects differently, often in a more effective way, and behavior is often more effective when you're working with real objects compared to images. So for example, my lab has found that infants and adults prefer to look at real objects compared to images. Jackie's got a very cool study where she's found that if you look at real objects, you evoke stronger processing in the motor system than if you look at images, because of course, real objects can be acted upon in ways that images cannot. Jackie's found that you have better memory for real objects, you pay more attention to real objects, you value real objects more, and even in patients you can, and this is some of the work that Jackie and Erez and others have done, that patients with disorders like visual agnosia do better if you have them recognizing real objects than if they're just looking at pictures. Some of the other stuff that Jackie and I have done together has shown that brains don't seem to adapt to real objects the same way they do to images, and the object representations, particularly in the dorsal visual stream, differ between real objects and images. So this is some data from my favorite brain area, AIP, which is involved in grasping in the key area in the dorsal visual stream. And if this is a representation of how similar activation patterns in AIP are when you're looking at real objects or photos. So if you see, for example, a real whisk versus a photo of a whisk. And what you can notice from this is that brain activation patterns are more similar between real objects and between photos than they are across these two formats. So for example, a real whisk is processed more similarly to a real candle or a real hammer than it is to a photograph of itself. And again, this might be because all of the real objects can be acted upon in ways that the photos cannot. So these were some of the seed ideas that really got me thinking about the importance of realism for actions, and the importance of realism in stimuli, particularly when people are interested in looking at brain areas where realism might matter, like the dorsal stream. And so taking this a step further and thinking about future directions, I started to think about this idea of pushing it even farther into this idea called immersive neuroscience. And this was a term I was wrestling a lot, and actually some of these ideas came out of some discussions with Nico Troia as we were talking about things like VR and so on. Pardon me. I realized that Nico and I had different terminologies for what we meant about realness and simulations and so on. And we were doing some stuff with virtual video games that I'll tell you about, which isn't really virtual reality, but I think the thing that all of these things have in common is trying to push things closer to reality. So the gold standard, of course, would be genuine reality, but we can also think about other simulations that can include things like virtual reality or different sorts of task scenarios that you might be able to program with video games and so forth that maybe aren't VR, but still are moving in the direction of realism. So I'm coining this term immersive neuroscience to refer to this blanket of these different things that include a move towards more realistic stimuli, towards more realistic tasks, and more realistic processes. And I'll explain a little bit more at the end of the talk what I mean by the processes, but the term that I really like that comes from Eleanor Maguire is studying the freely behaving brain. So studying things rather than under the very canned experimental protocols we all use, moving a little bit more to something where the subject can determine their fate rather than the experimenter. And so as we've been thinking about some of this, and as Jackie and I have been working on a review article to put forward some of these ideas, one way that we've come to conceptualize the way that we're thinking about immersive neuroscience is that the approaches that we can use in cognitive neuroscience historically have focused on largely reductionist approaches, and these have been foundational. I don't want to at all convey the notion that these haven't had good values. So the line that I often say is that Hubel and Wiesel would have never figured out visual cortex had they been trying to study the real world. So those reductionist approaches were really crucial, especially in the early days, and especially when looking at lower level, or looking at some of the earliest stages of perception and so on. So we've got lots of these sort of reductionist stimuli that include things like dots and lines and gratings and kinematograms and stereograms and point light displays and so on. And they've been essential for unpacking what components of perception are crucial for the visual system, particularly early visual areas. And then, of course, we can get into things like line drawings and photos, and we can even do things like record movies of those to get into things that have a time dimension. Of course, there's lots of great people at York who are looking at stereo vision, which you can do many different ways, including anaglyphs and other better ways. And now, of course, in over the past decade or so, we've come with the development of affordable consumer grade and research grade apparatus. There's a lot more options for doing high caliber virtual reality and augmented reality studies. And so we start to get this niche in here. But even within these kind of simulations, there's different degrees of realism. So you can imagine with just 3D images, you have stereo, but not parallax. You add VR, you get parallax. You can, as the technology gets better, maybe we can include better haptics into our virtual reality. Augmented reality, of course, has a lot of benefits because it's got that combination of a lot of the real stuff. And then, of course, at the far end, we've got this anchor of realism. And if we're talking about things like object recognition, Jackie and I often use terms like solids or tangible objects to distinguish them from some of the things that might have a virtual representation. So the way that we're thinking about it is historically, vision science has spent most of its time here. Jackie and I and others have spent some time here, and now we've got this whole new span here. And I think having this whole spectrum gives us a lot of benefits in that historically vision science has taken an approach that we call the build-up approach of you start to understand light and spots and lines and junctions and objects and so on, and you keep building up. And that's been very powerful, but we think there's also some room for what we're calling the tear down approach, in which you start with reality and you come to understand what's important in reality. And often reality has a lot of redundancies. And so we think that sometimes you might reach different conclusions if you go from the build-up approach to the tear-down approach, because if you add something, you might be able to take advantage of it, but if you remove it, it might not hurt you because there's other redundancies in the system. So what we're envisioning is something where vision science and other forms of cognitive neuroscience maybe can start to colonize some of these zones a little bit more. And often we can learn things from working at the whole spectrum of levels. Again, I want to emphasize that I don't mean to say that we should give up on some of the reductionist approach. I think they're very complementary. But we are also thinking about things like how we can validate some of the proxies that we use. And I'll give you some examples here. So as I mentioned, I'm really excited about the prospects of virtual and augmented reality as a medium, in large part because reality is a big pain. And those of you who've seen me talk about this is our device that we call the Droid, the delivery of real objects for imaging device. It's this gigantic conveyor belt. It takes hours to set up. And anybody who's been in my lab and worked with it, like Jackie or Erez, can tell you what a pain reality is. And so if we could use virtual reality, that would be great. If we can use it in the scanner with things like the ProPix 3D projector, or if we can use it with head-mounted displays and so on, then I think that would make all of our research lives easier. But I do think we have this question about, when is virtual reality and other forms, when is it a good proxy and when is it not? And I don't see this as an all or none question. I think it depends in part on the sorts of things that people want to study. And I picked a couple of papers here that I think take more extreme views. I haven't seen if Nico is here, but I'm really curious to talk to Nico about some of these ideas because he wrote an interesting perspectives piece. In perception, also championing the benefits. So there he is. Hi, Nico. Championing the benefits of virtual reality. And if I understand his perspective, I think what he was arguing in that piece is that there's a lot of benefits to VR because it gives you this sense of presence. And he sees one of the critical components of that being motion parallax and the ability to control what one sees. And again, this kind of fits into the idea of the feedback loops. There's some quotes here from his article and some speculation that maybe because you've got this more active control and presence that you might recruit the dorsal stream more than you would with some of the more reduced proxies. So that's one perspective. There's other perspectives as well that highlight the limitations of virtual reality and why it might not give you the same recruitment of brain areas and the same behavior as genuine reality. And that includes the fact that at least current day virtual reality does not give you haptic feedback or does not give you very good haptic feedback. And so you end up doing something that's more like pantomiming. And there's a long line of research from Mel Goodale and others that suggests that pantomiming kicks you more into a ventral stream mode. And then, of course, the other limitation with modern day virtual reality is that, there's limitations like the divergence accommodation conflict that mean that you don't have a consistent set of depth cues and so on if you want to use it to study things like that. And then I always get in these debates every time I talk about stuff like this and Mel's there. Mel always says, but surely if, these are just technical limitations of modern day VR, and once we fix those, then you won't be able to tell the difference. And maybe we're living in the matrix already and we just don't know it. And that, that could be that we'll get to that point. Although even then, I think that even if you have the perfect virtual reality system, where the vision is perfect and the haptics are perfect and so on, if you can't actually interact with something, if you see a perfect hamburger and you can feel the squishiness of the bun, but you know that you can't reach out and take a bite and satisfy your hunger, then it's still not going to be the real thing. And so some of these things, the factors that matter might depend on what you want to study. If you want to study vision, maybe the divergence accommodation conflict is important. Maybe for actions, haptics is. Maybe if you're concerned with things like valuation and neuroeconomics and so on, then maybe none of these things matter if you know ultimately that something isn't real. Okay. And so the other thing we've been thinking about is how can we evaluate the quality of different proxies like virtual reality for investigating particular types of research questions. And so we've got this flow chart here where we propose that you can do some experiments where you can compare reality to a proxy. And you can see if you find that there's no difference between the way people behave in reality and the way they behave with the proxy, then that gives you some validation for the proxy, and you can feel more confident in using that. If you find that there is a difference, then you can do follow-up experiments to determine what the source of that difference is. And in some cases, it might be technological, especially because there's still a lot of room for things like virtual reality systems to improve. And so there might be opportunities there to work with industry to improve the technology to make it more comparable to reality when reality might be important. And then you can make this an iterative thing where you can improve the tech and then hope that that's going to help it make it a more valid proxy. And of course, there's other interesting theoretical components here where you can, just by understanding what those differences are, can give us some interesting insights into how the brain works. But ultimately, with all of these approaches, the goal is to develop real-world applications that have some validity. Okay, so that's the end of my introductory part. Hopefully I've given you a sense of some of the things that we're thinking about in this domain we're calling immersive neuroscience. For the next part of the talk, what I want to do is just give you some examples of some recent research from my lab, or at least what we've been able to finish up given all of the insanity of 2020. So one project that we've been doing has been to look at whether it really matters how realistic a hand is depicted when you're performing an action. And ultimately, this has questions for virtual reality, but as you'll see, we started with reality. And this was something I spent a lot of time thinking about because I have a lot of colleagues at Western and some at York who do a lot of studies of motor learning where we'll have people doing an action and we'll just represent the hand with a cursor. And so as I'm sitting on all these advisory committees and so on, I'm always there wondering, how well does a cursor represent the hand? For some things, it certainly is useful, but is there any benefit to making displays where the hand looks like a hand? We know, of course, from studies of biological motion, including Nico's and others, that the brain is surprisingly good at extracting information about movement kinematics from very sparse displays. That's certainly been true for point light walkers. My reading of the literature is it's a little less clear for things like point light hands about whether people are really the degree to which having point lights is sufficient. There's also interesting questions here in terms of the virtual reality technology development. So we've been playing around in my lab a little bit with the Leap Motion, and it gives you this option in Leap Motion rather than rendering a full-blown hand, it renders the hand as these kind of skeleton things. And some of this might have interesting applications for things like image-guided surgery with augmented or virtual reality. If you're using augmented reality, you can see the hands themselves, but you could even imagine there might be benefits to not seeing the whole hand if you could have a situation where the hand isn't including other stuff that you need to see. So altogether, the question we kind of converged on is, well, does it really matter if the hand is represented by a point or a number of points or a skeleton or something that really looks like a hand? And some of the reason I thought this question was interesting also comes from some of the work in functional MRI that my lab and others have done. So we know from functional MRI studies, here we're looking at a picture of the left cerebral cortex inflated and the right cerebral cortex. So we've got the occipital pole and the temporal pole. And here we've got this lateral occipitotemporal cortex here. And there's some regions here in this. This would be classically considered part of the ventral visual stream. And it contains lots of regions specialized for motion and objects and faces and stuff. But there's a couple of subdivisions that seem to be responsive to bodies and body parts. including hands. So the extrastriate body area, shown here in red, responds more to bodies and body parts than other types of stimuli. This area here, this what's sometimes called LOTC hand, responds more when people are looking at hands than when they're looking at other body parts or full bodies. And so these are kind of interesting areas here. They're in the ventral visual stream. And so the assumption of most of the people who've studied areas like this is that they're perceptual areas because they're in the ventral stream. But we've had a few reasons to think that maybe it's more than just perception. Maybe these areas could be important for actions as well. Again, coming back to this idea that perception and action is a closed loop, and seeing your hand is an important factor in being able to do accurate hand actions. So there's a couple of pieces of evidence that make me think this. One comes from some of the work that Jason Gallivan did in my lab, where we did some fMRI studies of hand and tool actions. And we found when we looked at that point, we weren't aware of this hand area, but we were aware of the extrastriate body area. And we found that in the extrastriate body area, we could predict at the time before the participant did an action, whether they were going to do a grasp or a reach. And we found another area that was responsive to tools, and there we could predict better than chance whether the person was going to grasp or reach when they were using a tool. And so this started to suggest, along with other evidence, that maybe these areas don't just have information about the visual appearance of these things. Maybe the visual appearance is important for planning and guiding and correcting hand actions. Another piece of evidence comes from a project that I was involved in with Tamar Macon at Oxford at the time, now at UCL in London. And she had an interesting population of people who had just one hand. So there were people who were congenitally born with one hand, and there were people who were born with two hands, but had amputations. And so we put these one-handed individuals in the scanner, and we showed them pictures of hands and prostheses. And one of the interesting things that we found was that in these individuals, there was stronger activation when they were looking at prostheses. There were stronger activation in both these lateral occipital hand and body areas, and in some of the sensory motor hand and body areas. And that activation in these prosthesis users was stronger than what it was in control subjects. In addition, we looked at the connectivity between the visual hand areas and the somatosensory and motor hand areas using some functional connectivity approaches. And we found that the strength of connections between these visual and motor areas scaled with how much these individuals used the prosthesis. Which was kind of interesting. If you think about one-handers using a prosthesis, prostheses don't give you very good haptic feedback. And so if you don't have haptic feedback in order to do actions with the prosthesis, you have to rely heavily on visual feedback of the prosthesis. And thus it seems that there is this situation where there's more crosstalk between this so-called sensory hand area and these somatosensory and motor hand areas. Interestingly, this effect was only present in the one-handers. We also tested control participants who were spouses and friends and so on of the prosthesis users, and we found that there it didn't matter how long they'd observed someone use a prosthesis. It only mattered if the person was actually a user of the prosthesis. So this suggests that maybe some of these ventral stream areas are important for visual feedback and have this strong crosstalk with the motor system. So we really wanted to do a study with fMRI to look at hand realism in fMRI, but the problem was there hadn't even been very much behavioral work. And so my advice to the students in the group is never set foot in a scanner until you have a very good understanding of the behavior that you want to study first. And so I had an honors student, actually, sorry, I haven't given proper acknowledgements to my students, which I usually try to do. This was some work that was done by Prajit Sivakumar, who was an honors student in my lab a couple of years ago. So Prajit and I did this experiment, just behavioral, just to look at hand kinematics, depending on the realism of the hand. And so this was what we did here. And we did this, let me emphasize, this is all in reality. There had been some other studies that had tried to do some stuff in VR that I think had some serious methodological flaws because the VR was very imperfect. So we decided we were actually going to use reality. And this is how we did it. We had people wear these black gloves, and on the gloves, we could put reflective spheres or reflective tape that would be illuminated when we shone ultraviolet light on it. And so from the subject's point of view, this is what it looked like. So we could have a situation where they couldn't see the hand at all, where they could see just 2 points of the hand. They were doing a grasping task with precision grip with the index finger and thumb, like this. So the most crucial points on the hand that they would need to see would be the index finger tip and the thumb tip. So we put reflective markers just at those two locations. Or we did something more like a point light display where we put point lights at all of the major joints of the hand. Or we did something that was more like a skeleton where we had those 21 points and then we joined those points with reflective tape so that you could see more of the geometry of the hand. And then finally, in the last condition, the participants just wore white gloves that reflected the whole thing. So we have 5 different levels of hand feedback here. And we also crossed that in a 5x2 design with 2 levels of target feedback where either the participant could see the sphere that they were grasping or they couldn't. So what we found was for some measurements that we took, the target feedback mattered. So this is an example here with reaction time. So people were faster to react when they could see the target than when they couldn't. If we looked at the total movement time, however, we saw that people were fastest when they either had the skeleton view or the full hand view. So these 2 conditions were the best in terms of how fast you could move. And then you could see there's this gradient here where the worst condition is when you can't see the hand, and then 2 point and 21 point. If we looked at how fast people could reach, again, this just depended on target feedback. If we looked at what this measure is here, this is what we call the time after peak velocity. This is basically how much, as you go to reach, you initially go fast and then you slow down. So as you're approaching the object in a reach to grasp action, the more uncertain you are, the more time you're going to give in this slowing phase. So this is a measure of how long is this slowing phase. And again, you can see that it's shorter in these 2 conditions when you have the skeleton or the full hand feedback. We saw a similar thing if we looked at the slowing of how fast they closed the index finger and the thumb. And then the one that was sort of the most surprising and the most interesting is, this is a variable that we study a lot in grasping studies, which is the maximum grip aperture. So if you watch someone doing a grasp, you'll see that as the hand approaches, it's initially larger than the object and then it closes down. And generally what you find is that the more uncertain people are about what they're doing, for example, if they're doing it with no visual feedback, the more they open their hand as they approach. And that kind of gives them a margin of error so that they're less likely to fumble the object. So the maximum grip aperture here in the view of some is sort of a reflection of how big a margin of error do you do. So if it's big, then you're leaving yourself a big cushion in case you screw up. And if it's small, then that indicates that maybe you're more confident about what you're doing. And here we see this somewhat complicated pattern. So here, this was the only variable for which we saw an interaction between hand and target feedback. And really the things that I want to point out to you here, the way you can think about this complicated situation is, remember, lower is better. So the conditions when people do the best are when they have full feedback of the hand, regardless of whether they can see the target or not, and when they can just see the index finger and the thumb and the target. So all of these conditions are the best and the other conditions are worse. And so the thing that really shocked us about this is it didn't follow this more feedback is better situation we'd seen in the other things. The most striking thing here is that actually seeing 21 points on the hand is worse than seeing 2. And then when you add the skeleton, then you get better again. And so we think what this is suggesting here is that in the case when you have the 21 points, it just looks like a jumble of points and you have a hard time telling which dot is which. When you add the skeleton, then it's easier to infer the shape of the hand. And when you even have just 2 points, even that is surprisingly good for these kind of hand actions. So taking these results together, what we saw from that study was that actions are faster with the full hand feedback or with skeleton feedback. So you don't necessarily have to have the whole hand. So that validates that maybe some of the things like what Leap Motion is doing isn't such a bad strategy of just rendering a skeleton, because then you can render it quickly and you can have less lag in your virtual reality rendering. And you also have the situation that, maybe you can have less occlusion by other things of the hand. But we find this interesting pattern with the grip aperture that suggests that the best scenarios are either just minimal feedback or full feedback. Some of these intermediate conditions like 21-point feedback are actually suboptimal. Okay. So that's one example. That's kind of more, and I should mention, we're hoping to bring this into the scanner and look at some of this with fMRI now that we have an understanding of the behavior. So that's one example of some of the things that we can do to ask these questions of, for example, in this case, it's, well, what is a good proxy for visualizing the hand? And we've concluded that, well, the skeleton's a decent proxy and even 2-point feedback isn't that bad. Let me give you another example of something that we can look at to look at how well virtual reality can do in studying perception. And the type of perception I'm focusing on here is the perception of size and distance. So this is a behavioral study that we did with Margaret Maltz, also known as Margarita Maltseva, for those who know her through CREATE. So Rita, as part of her PhD, did this project where we were interested in how people perceive size and distance in real life. So we had 2 common objects. We had a die, as in one of a pair of dice, that was the typical size of a die, and we had a Rubik's Cube that was the typical size of a Rubik's Cube. So a die this big and a Rubik's Cube that big. And then we also manufactured 2 other versions. We manufactured a Rubik's Cube that was the size of a die and a die that was the size of a Rubik's Cube. And then we put these objects in a tunnel in the dark so that the only thing that the participant could see was this object that looked like it was freely floating in the middle of nowhere. And we had the participants just gauge how big they thought it was and how far away they thought it was. So they just did manual estimation using the finger and thumb to indicate how big they thought it was. And they used manual estimation with the 2 hands to indicate how far away they thought it was. We carefully chose the distances that we used. So we had 2 objects, 2 sizes and 2 distances. So those distances could be 25 centimeters or 91 centimeters, and those were very carefully chosen such that there was one combination of sizes and distances that yielded the same retinal angle. And so just to keep the rest of the presentation of this simple, I'm just going to focus on this one condition where retinal angle is matched, just because it gets a bit complicated if we show the whole data set. So we're just looking at the situation where we either have an object that's small and near or large and far, and they subtend the same retinal angle. And so we can think of 2 different hypotheses here. So here we're plotting how big the participant perceived the size and how big or how far away they perceived the distance. And all of the points that are on this blue line would fall on the equivalent of a 4.7 degree visual angle object. And so the true sizes and distances are here. And so if the subjects are perceiving everything completely veridically, then the data should look like this. The small near object should be perceived here, and the large far object should be perceived there. Alternatively, if the participants are relying heavily on the familiar size, you have a lifetime of having learned that dice are this big and Rubik's Cubes are that big. If that has a strong influence, then you would expect that the physical size and distance wouldn't matter, and you would just perceive the dice as small and near, regardless of its actual size and distance, and the Rubik's Cube as large and far. So hopefully these hypotheses are clear. And the way that we can compute the variable we were most interested in is something that we call the familiar size effect. And that is, if you take two objects that have the same physical size and physical distance, so a Rubik's Cube and a die that are physically the same, how different do you perceive them? So in the case when perception is veridical, the familiar size effect should be effectively 0. And in the case where familiar size has a complete effect, then the familiar size effect should be very large. So these are the two extremes in the hypotheses. Now let's look at the actual data. So here's the data point when we had participants looking at the objects in reality with full binocular vision. And you can see that, they're not great, but overall the trends are closer to veridical, that you perceive the small near objects as smaller and nearer, the large far objects as larger and farther. And there's a bit of a familiar size effect, but not too much. We also did a version of the experiment where we had them looking at it monocularly through a pinhole. So by doing that, we remove vergence as a depth cue and we remove accommodation as a depth cue. And so in that case, you should have to rely quite heavily on familiar size, and indeed you do. So we see in the monocular pinhole situation that the familiar size effect is much larger. After that, we did another experiment that was done by an honor student in the lab last year, Anna Zhebka. And Anna did basically the same experiment, but in virtual reality. So we had a VR die and a VR Rubik's Cube, and we only tested these conditions that have the same retinal angle. So same idea, subjects are doing exactly the same task. The only difference is now the stimuli are virtual. So again, here for reference on the top, I'm plotting what happened for real objects. And now I'm going to show you what happened for virtual objects. So when we looked at virtual objects under monocular conditions, the results were pretty much the same as what we saw in reality. So far, so good. But then we also had people do virtual reality binocularly. And this is the most surprising result here. We would have predicted that if VR was a good proxy for reality, that the data here should look like the data here, that we should have a fairly small familiar size effect, but we don't. They've still got vergence cues. They've lost accommodation cues because of VR, but it seems like they're really not able to use those cues very much because the familiar size effect makes it look more like monocular pinhole viewing than it does like binocular viewing. And so this is an example where we see that size and distance perception in virtual reality differs from reality for the reasons that I just said. And we think we're doing some other experiments to follow up on this, including with Laurie as a collaborator on some of these. We think that some of this is the most likely explanation is because of this major limitation of virtual reality, which is that you don't have accurate accommodation. So in the real world, if you're looking at a particular object, your eyes are verging on that object and the lenses in your eyes are focusing on that object. In virtual reality, because everything's presented on a display screen, you're always accommodating at the display screen, even if your eyes are verging elsewhere. And this conflict, we think what might be going on here is that this conflict is making you trust these oculomotor cues less in virtual reality than you would in reality. So this suggests that the vergence accommodation conflict may, for some applications, may lead to some limitations of VR. But it can also provide some options for how we could make VR better, that maybe we can think about other cues we can provide, like relative size cues or proprioceptive cues that can help. Okay, I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to skip some stuff and just tell you a little bit. If I can I take another 5 minutes? Laurie's nodding. Okay.
Yes, you can. Go for it.
Okay. So let me just tell you a little bit about what we're doing in some of our future directions. So there's two main future directions that I want to take the lab. One is looking for better techniques for reality. So I've mainly been using functional MRI to study brain function, but functional MRI has a lot of problems in its limitations in terms of the spatial things, the constraints, the fact that you can't move very much before all your data goes haywire. There's some possibilities people are developing, including wearable MEG, wearable PET, but the one that I'm most excited about is optical neuroimaging. So the main form of that these days is fNIRS, functional near infrared spectroscopy. And for those who haven't encountered this before, the idea is that you can shine light into the skull. You can have light emitters that shine light into the skull, and you can have light detectors that measure light. And some of that light, it's going to diffuse in all sorts of different directions, but some of that light is actually going to make its way from the light source to the light detector. And if the distance between these is far enough, then some of that can actually pass through the superficial level layers of the brain. So you can actually get into the brain with this technique, and you can shine light wavelengths that are absorbed by oxygenated and deoxygenated hemoglobin. So long story short, you can use light to infer the amount of oxygenated and deoxygenated hemoglobin in this, what's called, this is my favorite term, in this photon banana. You can use the properties of the photon banana for oxygenated and deoxygenated hemoglobin to infer brain activation. So one major benefit of this is that it's wearable. You don't have to have people in a 60-centimeter tube, and those people can move more than they can in fMRI. And so there's even some devices like wearable fNIRS, and there's even some groups working with fNIRS and virtual reality. Of course, you can't do proper virtual reality in an fMRI scanner because you can't move your head and get motion parallax. And so even though you can do 3D, it's limited. This is just a quick slide in case anybody hears of any opportunities to get our hands on this. There's a newer version of optical neuroimaging called HD DOT that I'm really excited about, except it's not at all ready for prime time. It's the same idea as fNIRS, except that it's much denser and it uses different analysis techniques. And the reason I'm really excited about it is it gives resolutions that are comparable to fMRI and that are much better than the typical sort of thing you get in fNIRS. So I really want to get my hands on this, but there's no commercial developers that are responding to emails yet. And I know there's a bunch of startup companies that are starting to work on this. Another direction that I want to go in is using virtual reality and virtual gaming to develop more compelling simulations. So maybe I won't say too much about this, just to say that, you know, one of the things that we've done a lot in cognitive neuroscience is to break cognition into many different silos. And you can see that in any kind of textbook that you look at. But ultimately, we want to be able to understand how these things work together. If you think of real world things, you're not doing sensation separately from action and memory. You're doing things that involve all of those things unfolding. I won't say too much about this just in the interest of time, but there has been a whole domain that's been kind of fun where people have moved more towards naturalism in fMRI by showing people in brain scanners movies. And the cool thing that they find with this approach is that if you show people the same movie clip, the original study used the good, the bad, and the ugly, you find that their brain activation rises and falls in synchrony with one another and in synchrony with the movie. And so this is an example of how naturalistic cognition can be studied with, or how you can find out things through more natural stimuli like movies. And there's been some other people who have validated that this is a good proxy. For example, if you look at face selective areas done the conventional way, they also show the face area also oscillates in synchrony with whether or not there are faces on the screen. But when you look at this approach works really well for some parts of the brain. If you want to study the ventral stream and the sensory system and semantic systems, it's pretty good. If you want to study the motor system or decision making and executive function kind of stuff, it's bad. And so I was sitting in a talk one day about the movie stuff, and I thought, well, what would you have to do to tickle the motor cortex and the frontal lobes and so on to get this technique to work better across the board? And the thing I started thinking about was maybe having more active paradigms like virtual gaming. And so we're starting to do a whole bunch of different studies trying to look if we can use video games in order to study actions, in order to study visual stimuli, and in order to look at cognitive processes that are under the control of the participant rather than under the control of the experimenter. And this requires some new analytic approaches to do that kind of stuff. So this is a direction we're building up a team at Western who's doing some of these things, but there might be some potential to do to expand that initiative if the proof of concept works. So let me summarize the talk as a whole here. What I hope I've shown you is that there's growing evidence suggesting that realism might matter more than we've been aware of in cognitive neuroscience, that there's the potential for cognitive neuroscience to move more towards this approach that I'm calling immersive neuroscience that can involve a combination of looking at real life situations and looking at compelling simulations like virtual reality or virtual gaming. We've talked a little bit about how we might be able to test when things are good proxies or not. And I've talked a little bit about some of the future directions. So really, one of the messages here for some of the students and so on is I think where the field is right now is here. And what I'm proposing isn't that we get rid of that, but that there's a lot of room in cognitive neuroscience for people to move out to some of these less explored domains. And the other thing that I hope I've maybe at least planted a seed for is thinking about where we might be able to do some things together. So both York CVR and Western has the Canada First Research Excellence Fund grants, and we've done a few things together, but for me, it actually feels like that there's maybe some opportunities to do more than we have there. And there might also be other opportunities. I know we have other collaborations through CREATE grants with Germany and things like that. And I've been talking with different groups about possibilities like a new Frontiers in Research Fund, what's the new one called? Transformation Program. And we've had one preliminary meeting amongst some of us to talk about what we might be able to do for virtual reality. So hopefully by giving you an overview of some of these ideas, we can see if there's some promising fodder for collaborations. And with that, I'll stop. Sorry, I went a few minutes over time there.
Hey, thanks, Jody. That's super. So I'm going to moderate some questions